Whether it's fighting to the last at the gates of the Hornburg, or saving the day on the Pelennor fields, nobody epitomizes the bravery of men quite like the Warriors of Rohan. And quite frankly, there's nobody cooler in Middle-earth. If you've been playing Lord of the Rings for a long time, you probably have a lot of Warriors of Rohan that you might need to paint up. And with the release of the new starter set, you're about to have a lot more. Fortunately, I've got you covered. For this tutorial, I'm going to paint an archer, but the same techniques are of course usable across any Rohan warrior. The first step is to base coat the model. For this, I've used Zandri Dust Spray because it gives a good base coat to the many greens and browns on the model, but you can use any colour. Just be aware that over, say, black, you may need several passes of the base colours to get an even coverage. Anyway, let's begin with the messiest part of the model. Base coat any areas you want to be iron in Leadbelcher. For this model, that's mostly the body scale armour, but also, for example, the shin greaves, and also the metal parts of any spears, axes or swords. Once that's dry, we're going to wash over the metal with Nuln oil. I'm applying this directly out of the bottle, and you can be generous, but if it begins to pool in flatter areas where you don't want too much build-up, you can just dry off the brush and soak up any excess, and redistribute it over the model. You could of course leave the metal here, but to bring back some heroic shine, we're going to take Stormhost Silver, and use this just to dot highlight the tip of each scale, and dry brush any chainmail. This step is a bit time consuming, but it's definitely worth it. We can also use Stormhost Silver to edge highlight the spears and the blades of any hand weapons. And once that's done, with the metal finish, I'd recommend changing your water before we move on to other areas, to prevent any of the metal pigment contaminating your other paints. The next biggest area to paint is the leather, which we're going to base coat in Rhinox hide. This is areas, for example, like the helmets, arm guards, gloves and quivers. We're also going to base coat any of the under fabric areas we want to be dark red with this too. Once that's dry, wash all of the leather with Fyreslayer Flesh Contrast. This may seem strange, but will provide some shading into the recesses and ramp up the warm red tones which we want for this leather. When that's dry, we're going to take Rhinox hide and add some Scrag Brown, about 3 parts to 1, and begin to highlight the leather. For flatter or rounder areas like the helmets, we can dilute it to a glaze consistency, and, making sure not to overload the brush too heavily, begin to glaze over the areas. On other areas, we can use this at a regular consistency and begin to build back the colour. Next, add in more Scrag Brown until we're at a 50-50 mix, and work back over all the leather areas in the same way. Begin to edge highlight things like the quiver and glaze it back over the helmet, covering a slightly smaller area. With pure Scrag Brown, we're going to put thin edge highlights on the sharpest folds and edges, things like the cheek guards or any creases in the leather. We can also use this to draw some scratches across the leather, indicating wear and use. And finally, with a 50-50 mix of Scrag Brown and Averland Sunset, we're going to spot highlight the most prominent points and edges of the leather. For the red cloth, cover the area in Khorne red, leaving Rhinox hide only in the deepest folds. Whilst this is still wet, we can do some quick wet blending. Add in some of the Averland sunset we were just using for the leather, and begin to build up some highlights on the raised areas. If you work fast, you can blend this into the Khorne red and begin to build up a smooth highlight. And keep adding in Averland sunset to a point you're happy with, and then with a 50-50 mix of both colours, do a simple edge highlight. For my models, I like to paint some of the fabrics as a rough, undyed cloth, for example the undershirts. Base coat any of these areas with Rakarth flesh. Then, with a 50-50 mix of Rakarth flesh and Pallid witch flesh, cover the fabric, leaving the deepest recesses base coated. With pure Pallid witch flesh, edge highlight the fabric areas. And then dot highlight the highest points like the elbows with white scar. Moving on to the distinctive brown cloth of Rohan warriors, base coat the area with Dryad bark. You may need more than one coat here, but just keep your paints thin and wait for each layer to dry before applying the next. Don't forget the arms, and be very careful here so as not to get Dryad bark over anything you've already painted. When that's dry, wash all the Dryad bark areas with Wildwood contrast paint. Give that a good while to dry completely. Then, with thinned Dryad bark, re-establish that base colour, leaving Wildwood in the recesses. Make a mix of 50-50 Baneblade brown and Dryad bark, thin this to a glaze, and then begin to build up a highlight on the cloth, moving the paint towards the bottom where you want it to be lighter. Also edge highlight the folds and creases with this. With pure Baneblade brown, do the same thing, thinning the paint to a glaze and working towards the feet, covering a smaller area. We can also use this paint to add dots and lines simulating scratches and wear, perfect for a rough fabric. With a 50-50 mix of Baneblade brown and Rakarth flesh, finish by edge highlighting the most prominent areas. Now, the iconic green cloak is probably the most distinctive Rohan feature. For ours, we're going to begin with a base coat of Death Guard green. The next step might seem unusual, but we're going to add a little bit of Rhinox hide into this, about 1 part to 4, thin it slightly, and we're going to apply it into the recesses to shade the cloak. Now I'm adding the Rhinox hide because I want a slightly red-brown tone to the shading, tying the cloak in with the other areas of the model. Thinning this slightly also helps the contrast seem less stark. If you go over anywhere you don't want with this, just touch back up with Deathguard Green. To begin highlighting, we're going to add in some Screaming Skull until we're at about a 75 to 25 mix. Thinning this down, begin to glaze over the flatter areas to start building up a highlight, and give some nice thick edge highlights to the folds in the cloth. We'll add in more Screaming Skull until we're at about a 50-50 mix, and perform a similar thing to build up more layers. With a 75-25 mix of Screaming Skull and Deathguard Green, carefully edge highlight the most prominent folds in the cloth. And finally, with a mix of about 10% Deathguard Green to 90% Screaming Skull, spot highlight the most extreme points just to catch the eye. For the black leather, base coat these areas with Abaddon black, that's the boots and also any belts and straps. Go over the boots with a 50-50 mix of Abaddon black and Dawnstone, covering most of the leather and leaving only the creases and deepest areas black. Edge highlight all of the leather with Dawnstone. You can also use this to paint some scratches and cracks along the belt. Finally, spot highlight with Ulthuan Grey on the highest points or where any cracks meet the edges of the belt, etc. Base coat the flesh with Flayed 1 flesh. Some models are wearing gloves and have large helmet face guards, so there might not be flesh visible on every model. Once that's dry, shade the flesh with Reichland Flesh Shade. Then repaint Flayed 1 flesh, leaving the recesses shaded. And then with Screaming Skull, spot highlight the most extreme points, the tips of the nose, the cheekbones, the knuckles, the fingertips. If you want, you can paint in the eyes at this point. We can now turn to the iconic blonde hair and beards of the Rohirrim. Base coat these with Averland Sunset for a really vibrant base. You may need multiple coats. Then shade the hair with snakebite leather contrast. When that's dry, re-establish the Averland Sunset, leaving the deeper recesses shaded. For the beards, we're going to do this by starting to apply vertical strokes, beginning to build up something like the texture of the beards. Highlight with a mixture of 50-50 Averland Sunset and Screaming Skull. Again, for the beard, we're going to pick out individual strands with vertical strokes even more. And for the hair, we can turn the brush sideways and edge highlight, using the brush just to pick out the raised areas. Finally, with pure Screaming Skull, pick out the most prominent points. Base coat any bronze areas with Hashut copper. This includes the trim on the helmets, but also any sword hilts. Then shade the bronze with Carroburg crimson. Finally, highlight these areas with Liberator gold. For the fletching on the arrows, just paint these in the same way as for the black leather, moving from black through to Dawnstone, and then Ulthuan Grey. And then all that's left to do is base your model in your chosen scheme. And there we are, Rohan Warriors. I've painted a few here to show you how you can vary the colours and mix and match areas to add some variation across the unit and make each warrior feel distinct. For some, I've painted the helmets in iron and bronze. On some, the shin guards are leather, and on some, the undyed cloth is much more prominent. It's all about just using the same paints, just varied model by model. You can also notice that I've sponged on some Rhinox hide to simulate mud spatters. Just take some Rhinox hide and tear off a bit of sponge, regular makeup sponge will do, dip it in the paint and work most of it off, and then gently dab this across the bottom of the cloak. And with that, your models look as if they've just come from a hard-fought battle on Pelennor fields themselves. Anyway, I hope you found this tutorial useful and you'll use it to paint up your own Sons of Éorl. As always, please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. It really helps, and let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see me paint next. In any case, I'll see you next time, and until then, happy painting.